I'm Dan Poblocki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with artists working in the genre today. So, I've been waiting a while for someone to pick today's topic, a formative, if not the singularly formative pop culture experience of my childhood. Disney's The Haunted Mansion. Not the couple of films that the studio has put out in the past 20 or so years, but the rideable attraction from Disneyland and Walt Disney World Resort. And I've got horror author and Bram Stoker Award finalist Sam Rebelein to thank for cracking open this creaky doorway. I won't spend too much time introducing it here because, first of all, if you haven't heard of Disney's Haunted Mansion, I literally cannot help you. At all. In any way. But mostly because of the giant monologue you're about to hear me do for Sam during our conversation. Sorry about that, Sam, if you're listening. I will say this was a really fun conversation because Sam is just really fun to talk to. But I'll let you be the judge, jury, and axe-wielding spectral bride to make that decision. Sam Rebelein is the author of the novel Edenville and the brand new collection of linked short horrors, The Poorly Made and Other Things, as well as the upcoming Galloway's Gospel, all of which are set in his connected literary universe of Renfield County, a place I would rather not visit in person. Sam and I chat about these stories and what inspired them around the Hudson Valley, where we both happen to live. And Sam also graciously allowed me to psychoanalyze him, without a license, I might add. So, stay tuned, or at least turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore our first fears. Hey there, Sam. How's it going?
Hey, pretty good, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining me for this chat about Disney's The Haunted Mansion attraction.
Oh, dude, it really, if I could talk to the little 6-year-old kid in bed with his, I don't know exactly what it was, but it was like a big hardcover book that detailed everything in Disney World, you know? And the page about the Haunted Mansion was the, it was sucked into that page. So I'm excited to talk about it today and everything related to it.
I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on all of this stuff that we're going to get into and more, and your books. When you have a new book coming out, if not already out by the time that this airs, and we'll talk about that as well. It's called The Poorly Made and Other Things. So great. So we want to get that out there so listeners know what to go find at the bookstore and pick up off the shelves. Sam's really scary, really wild ride of storytelling here. You know, like I said, I begin with every conversation with 2 questions, and the first one I have for you is, could you tell us about yourself, your work, and your relationship to the horror genre?
Sure. I'm Sam. Hi, everybody. I grew up in the Hudson Valley in New York, but I moved around a little bit before then. When I was 5 through 8, I lived in Cincinnati in this big suburban area outside the city. And that was when I first started to fall in love with Goosebumps, which was my first foray into reading horror. And you know, he had such a great way, R.L. Stine had such a great way of confirming your fears as a kid. And I think there were a lot of books around that time that were coming out like that. There was a series of sort of picture books that were My Librarian is the Loch Ness Monster or something like that. There are a few of those. So there was a lot of content around that time that was plugging into sort of cliche childhood fears, your teachers are aliens, or yes, you shouldn't trust your weird uncle or whatever. So I was growing up at a good time to be sort of into spooky stuff. But I was also a very nervous kid, so it was that kind of fascination, but also tonguing a wound, you know, or picking at a scab or something. But when I moved to the Hudson Valley, this is such a creepy place in and of itself. I mean, immediately you start hearing about, you know, the Washington Irving of it all, and that just activated a whole nother level. So now I'm in Poughkeepsie. I work as a writing tutor at Dutchess Community College. If you're a student there, come up to the Writing Center. We'll help you get essay help.
Woohoo!
And yeah. And I don't know, what else can I say? I love buffalo chicken wraps. I just got a dog this week, so he might come.
Yeah, so I just saw your picture
He's
on Instagram.
He's so sweet. For years, I've wanted a dog named Frodo, so he could be Frodo and Sam. And I kind of always imagined it being like a derpier dog, like a corgi or something. But he's like an Arendelle Terrier mix, so he's a criminal mastermind in the making. He's already so smart. So I'm like, whoa. But yeah, so, over the years, my relationship with horror has been and kind of remains that same thing today in various ways, like the fascination with spooky stuff and kind of like using the anxieties that I already have, because I was such an anxious kid growing up and now have all new anxieties as an adult. Horror, I think, is a nice catharsis for that in so many ways. And there are still parts of the abyss that I'm like too nervous to go near. Like, I'm not a Terrifier guy at all. Things like that,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear you say all of that, because your books, Edenville and The Poorly Made, are some of the most intense, grotesque, and dark and bleak things that I've read recently, Sam. And very entertaining as well. So it's interesting to hear you say, you're like, well, I don't want to go too far. But I mean, Terrifier, yes. Terrifier films are probably the most intense and horrific and disgusting things I've seen ever in my life. So I definitely wouldn't put what you're writing into that category.
Well, I think it depends on like where the spectrum is. I love stories that and talking about Frodo and Sam, like Lord of the Rings is a story that has the whole spectrum, from the really creepy perilous shit where like, and I kind of want to rewatch Fellowship tonight after this, because Frodo hasn't seen it yet, but there's stuff in there, even after all these times that I've watched it, that I'm still like, oh, how are they going to make it, and all the way to the really light, humorous stuff. So I just love stories that have that whole spectrum and can swing all the way from like the catharsis could be anything on that track, and Terrifier feels like it's one of those, like it occupies a very small segment of the much lower end of that spectrum. So I like having that in stories where you can't quite tell if the next cathartic beat is going to be a laugh or a scream,
Oh yeah, I have questions about that for you regarding the topic that you brought to the podcast, the Haunted Mansion. So we can talk about that sort of push and pull as well. It's funny you talking about catharsis, because after I read Clayman Cloud Chapman's Wake Up and Open Your Eyes, which came out earlier this month.
Through it.
Oh God. That book really shredded my nerves again. All your adult horror authors are doing very incredibly intense things recently, and it sort of echoes what's happening all around the world. But in talking with Clay, he mentioned the cathartic aspect of him writing it and hoping that readers were able to get that as well. I think that's a valid and fair point you're making about the cathartic aspect of it. It's pretty interesting.
I think there's something, people always ask like, well, why are you doing this to me? Like why are you interested in writing horror? Why do you read horror? Why do you do that to yourself? And I'm like, I finally hit a point where I was like, that's the complete opposite question. Like for me, like even last night I was reading through some of the new novel that I have coming out this fall, which is also in the Renfield County world. And there was a scene in there that one of my friend beta readers was like, oh, this is such horrifying shit. Like, how did you think of this? And I was like, it was just a nightmare that I had. I didn't want to think of it at all, but writing about it and finding a context for it. Because as a nightmare, it just sort of was a scene that exists on its own, which makes it more horrible, but kind of inaccessible as a story. Because like, I mean, have you ever had that, right, where you have a nightmare and you're like, I gotta write this down, and you start writing it and you're like, what am I talking about? This is all nonsense. It's only scary in the like, so there's something about providing context for it and being like, okay, well, I'll plug it into this story and here's why this scene is happening, that makes it feel sort of less scary for me. And so then that's always kind of surprising when other people are like, oh, well, now I'm scared by this scene. And I'm like, oh, I feel like because I kind of foisted it onto you away from myself,
But also the idea that you are taking something that scared you and in the act of putting it down on the page sort of removes its teeth for you. I think that that's also kind of a cool aspect of being a writer of speculative fiction, and particularly very scary horror. I think that's an interesting point. The second question that I wanted to ask you, and which I ask all of the guests that come to talk to me on this podcast, is, can you tell us about the first time you recall ever feeling frightened?
Well, this, I have a clear image of, so sort of like a blackout injury. We had this house that was, sort of a circle. You could run from the kitchen to the living room and around the dining room and whatever. And I was playing tag with one of my friends around the house, and I was 4 years old, and he ran outside, and the glass door was just swinging shut behind him, and I put out a hand to, like, push the door back open, and my hand just went through the glass. Ooh. And when I pulled it back, like, sliced open the nerve bundle under my arm. So the fingers in my left hand still don't work all that well to this day. And so I just remember lying on the floor and looking up at my mom and the expression on her face, which, again, maybe there's an essay there about, like, the reactions from others, because especially as a kid, you don't really have that oh shit moment until you're like, oh, mom looks really scared,
Oh, yeah, wow.
And then being in the hospital, and I had one of those, like, picture books with the buttons on the side, whatever those are called, like, and you would push the buttons and they would make sounds, and so it was like a Winnie the Pooh thing. And I was there overnight, and from then on, it was just like the entire world was scary, right? And, like, I remember then after that, my dad was showing me, he was like, well, this is just, like, very strong. It's like Rhino glass was the brand or whatever. And so they replaced the glass, and he was like, this one is unbreakable. And I remember that being the first moment of really, like, distrusting an adult fear. Like, I don't know about this, That moment, like, in and of itself, I remember very little of. So it wasn't necessarily, like, I don't remember being scared in that moment, but it created a web of, like, so many things for me as a kid that I was just like, I just am afraid of the world, and the fact that it was kind of that it was a door to outside, I guess, is sort of symbolic as well. That it was just like, so it was like, I just want to stay inside.
Wow. But I am so sorry that happened to you, and I can totally see that would sort of color your entire view of the world, especially happening so young. And being in the hospital is a scary thing too, and having that permanent damage in your hand, like, no, that's super intense. I also relate to the idea of, like, seeing the fear in mom or dad's eyes, where, like, you're not sure if you should be scared yet, but, like, seeing them scared for you or about something that happened to you, like, that is a major revelation. And for that to happen really young, like, that's super intense.
Yeah. And, looking at pictures from that time, there was I was pretty smiley before then, and then there are maybe a year's worth of pictures after that where I wasn't smiling at all,
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, so that was the first time that and it makes me, now that I'm saying this all too, it makes me realize that that must have informed the type of horror that I felt attracted to when I was older, because it was like an outside fear, so I was always more interested in stories about, sort of the John Carpenter dichotomy of, like, the inner versus the outer horror. Outer horror always interested me more. I was always more interested in monsters or, like, what's out there, and the psychological elements are just like, chocolate and peanut. Like, if you have those two together, then that's the perfect, like, chef's kiss. But
that's what I recognize about what you're doing. It's like there's so much in your work that is very much body horror, that's very much about bodies being injured, you know, even people doing it to themselves on purpose first, and that's the psychological element. So these things inform who we become as artists, right? It's like, I hear you. How many years after that injury did you end up going to a Disney park?
Well, it must have been like 2 or 3, so pretty quick turnaround. And I don't remember where I got that book, but I had that big hardcover Disneyland book for a while, from like a library book sale or something. Yeah. And I remember I was kind of like, well, Epcot seems cool and whatever, but the images of those sort of like blacklight colored ghosts was the thing that I was the most interested in that book by far.
Okay. Cool. So let's get into this. Let's get into Disney's The Haunted Mansion attraction. I know we're talking about Disneyland or Walt Disney World, Magic Kingdom. Which one did you experience?
Yeah, what's the one in Orlando? I went to
that's the Magic Kingdom, Disney World.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so it's me too. That was I've actually never been to Disneyland, but I've been to Orlando and the Magic Kingdom. When I talk about topic of conversation that, you know, my guests bring to the podcast, I give a rundown and credits, and I'd like to do some of that for this particular attraction. And I'm sorry that this is going to kind of be monologuing, but like, I think like the sort of what I pulled from the web is sort of gives a history of what this thing is for people who live under rugs and have never heard of the Haunted Mansion at Disney World. So it's a dark ride, right? Like Snow White's Scary Adventures. I don't know if you remember, you ever did that, or Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. These were original to the Disneyland park that opened in 1955 in Anaheim in California. And I guess Walt Disney in 1951, before he built the park, wanted to have a haunted house in his park. I'm not sure if he's the one who came up with the idea that it would be a retirement home for ghosts. I think there was a lot of discussion about a plot or a storyline for this particular attraction. It never really played out. Different ideas floated about. Disney wanted a haunted house for his park. After a lot of discussion with different artists and animators and Imagineers, the exterior of that house was completed in 1963 in the New Orleans Square section. It was planned to be a walk-through ride, sort of like you were guided by some kind of host, right? Disney famously said he didn't want the exterior to look run down or anything, like he didn't want it to look like a traditional like haunted house. He wanted it to look well kept, but the inside, you know, the outside looked okay, but what was on the inside was the scary part. So Disney died in 1966, but his team continued on with the project, and the ride opened in California in 1969. I'm going to just list a team of creators and some background here. I'm sorry, I'm continuing to monologue, Sam.
No, this is great. I didn't know any of this, so this is fascinating.
Okay. Yeah, no, I just thought it would be interesting to sort of put some of the history into this conversation as well.
Yeah. Well, this is great, because I was worried that you were going to ask me about the history, and I was like, I didn't have time to look it up. I don't know.
There was a show on Disney Plus called Behind the Attraction, and there's a site on the internet called Doom Buggies, which is the actual like omni mover cart that you sit in and rides. Those are called Doom Buggies. So there's a site called doombuggies.com that has like all of the people are obsessed with this ride. So there's a lot of information out there. Awesome. But what I was able to sort of take from bits and pieces of the internet, there's an artist named Ken Anderson that Disney hired to design the exterior. He based the Anaheim park design on a house that actually exists in Baltimore, Maryland, called the Shipley Lydecker House.
I think I've
kind
heard
of wanted
that.
it to look. Yeah, he wanted it to look like a southern sort of plantation style home, and that house actually it almost looks exactly like what was built in the park in California. Some of the other artists and designers were Mark Davis, ex Atencio. He actually wrote the theme song in the ride called Grim Grinning Ghosts, which
awesome.
gets stuck in your head if you even think about it.
Yeah.
And he never written before. He was an artist. He was like an animator or something. So I thought that was pretty cool. There's an artist called Claude Coates, Rolly Crump, who actually did original designs for what Disney wanted to be called the Museum of the Weird inside the attraction, but that was never used or completed. It was thrown away. Yale Gracie and Rolly Crump actually teamed up to create many of the illusions that are in the Haunted Mansion, which is a huge part of the magic of that ride. And the artists, Davis and Coates, sort of in the design of the ride itself, argued over whether it should be scary or funny. And as we both know, it ended up being a little bit of both.
Yeah, I was going to say, porque no los dos. That's all I want.
Paul Frees is the guy who plays the ghost host, the narrator who introduces you into the house itself. And we've got to mention Leota Toombs, who was a Disney artist, and she was cast in the role of Madame Leota, the woman who exists inside that glass ball. Leota actually was voiced by a separate actor named Eleanor Audley. Now, to conclude this monologue, just want to mention that the park that we both went to, Disney World, had a different version that opened in 1971 in their section of the park called Liberty Square. And that building was based on, according to Behind the Attractions on Disney Plus, it was based on Hudson Valley mansions, which I did not know. I did not know until I watched that episode. So I think that's really cool, and we're going to go there.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So Sam, that's the rundown. That is the list of credits and a brief history of what I was able to sort of glean. There's so much more out there to learn about, like how so many of these things were put together, and it's really cool. And the ride has changed since it opened, and probably since you and I both visited that first time. Yeah. But Sam, for listeners, can you describe the ride through as you remember it, or at least your first experience of it?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, the short answer is kind of no, because I closed my eyes for the entire thing. My parents will say that I ran to the Haunted Mansion. We had to go there first, and we got into sort of the waiting area, right? And the ceiling started to lower. And that's when I closed my eyes, and I never opened them again. And I felt the doom buggy, we tilt back and you're looking up, and I might have opened my eyes like a little bit at that point to see some of the like stars, the glow in the dark stuff, and there's like owl eyes or something at that part.
Oh, yeah.
But I yearned to go back because I never opened my eyes once. And
Did you never re-ride the ride with your eyes open?
I never went back. I haven't been back since I was 7. When I was in college, I was studying abroad in England, and so I traveled a bit through Europe and went to Disney World Paris.
Okay.
And I don't think they have a Haunted Mansion there, but they do have a Tower of Terror. Do they really? Okay.
Yes, it's called Phantom. It's called Phantom Manor.
Oh,
all of the parks all over the world, the Disney parks, have their own version of this. If you want to know more about it, like there's that episode on Behind the Attraction on Disney Plus.
I'm gonna have to watch it. But no, I did do the Tower of Terror there, which was its own uniquely frightening experience because all the instructions and signs were in French, right? So they have big signs that are like, make sure you woodoo, and I'm like, and, it drops, and you're like, oh shit, I hope I did it right,
Well, but, you're sitting here talking to me, so I guess you did.
Yeah, but I brought this to the podcast because I felt like that was a really. I mean, then that was another whole system of fears where for years and years, like through most of high school, I would not do big rides. I hated roller coasters. I hated just anything. It sort of compounded my like arm fears of being afraid of the world. And I also, like, when I was younger, maybe 5 years old, went on a little like county fair roller coaster with my dad, and he made me put my arms up, and that was it. That was no more big rides for me. So we had this like whole trip planned to different parks in Orlando. You know, we went to the what was it called then, like 6 Islands of Adventure or whatever.
Universal Studios, Islands of Adventure, maybe. I don't know what everything changes all the time. They rebrand stuff, right? So it was before it was all the Harry Potter stuff. It was just like there was a Dragon World, and Jurassic Park World was still there, and I was a big Jurassic Park kid, so we had to do that as well. And that was all pretty fun. But like some of that other stuff, like the Jaws ride, I couldn't do. I didn't want to do the Back to the Future ride because they were like, yeah, the car bumps along, and I was like, nope. There was a lot of stuff, and I think it kind of started to bug my dad, because it's like, we came all this way and spent all this money, you don't want to do anything, which of course like didn't make me, you know, as a 6-year-old, you're not going to be like, gosh, you're right, I'm not afraid anymore. You know? Well, I spent all this money.
Yeah.
Don't be scared.
But then a couple of years later, the Haunted Mansion movie was coming out, and they had a PlayStation 2 game attached to it. And that was around the time when video game tie-ins were huge, and they would often come out before the movie was released. So you had a sense of what was going on in the movie just by playing the game. I played the game, and that was the first horror game I ever played. I mean, even before then, there was this really fucked up little PC game called Nightmare Ned, which I would highly recommend.
Oh, yeah.
Giving
you mentioned that, yeah.
Yeah, oh man. Nightmare Ned had some imagery that truly would give the poorly made a run for its money.
Really?
Yeah,
no way.
You play as this kid. Okay, so this is gonna be a little tangent, but
it's fine.
Nightmare Ned, you play as this kid who's afraid of everything. He is home alone because his parents are out and the power goes out, and so he hides in his bed. But then stuff starts getting nightmare-y, and he gets pulled down under the bed by these giant monster hands, and now he's in Nightmare World, and you have to navigate these different sort of themed nightmare worlds. There's a dentist world. There's the doctor's office is maybe a different thing. Yeah, there's dentist. There's the doctor's office. There's a school. He's afraid of the toilet for some reason. So there's like a toilet world. There's like attic world, graveyard world. You know, there's like maybe half a dozen of them. And so you have to kind of go around and you use your yo-yo as a weapon to like hit stuff. And as you hit things and like break ghosts and solve puzzles, the main ghouls of each world slowly become real people. And so the like graveyard ghoul slowly turns from this like Grim Reaper looking dude into your grandpa, and he's like, well, dying's nothing to be afraid of, Ned, you know, it's all right. And so you're slowly overcoming your fears. But some of the imagery, like the one I remember the most, or I'll say as like 2 quick things. There was one monster you had to like break his this is a kid's game, by the way. This came out for Windows 98. Yep. He was part of a tree. He was like a tree ghoul, and you had to break apart his ribs to like break his heart, and then he would burst. But he would block his ribs with his hands that had needles for fingers, and if you weren't quick enough, he would poke one of those needles into your ear and poke your brain out the other ear and back. And you don't have a health bar or anything, so you're not like losing damage, but he can just do that.
But your brain is being poked out of your head.
Yeah, so as a 6-year-old, you know, you're playing a video game, and like all of a sudden that happens, and you're like, ah! The other one, you're in the doctor's office, you're speeding down the hallway, you're strapped to a gurney, and you have to hit the arrow keys to go up or down, because these doctors are leaning out of these open doorways and swiping their hands at you. And so you have to dodge them. And if you don't dodge them, then they'll swipe out an organ. They'll just like swipe their hands and like hold like a weird pulsing organ.
Oh man, this is explaining so much to me after having read your stories. It's making a lot of sense, Sam.
Yeah, and this is so then at the end, any organs you've lost go in these jars. And these weird little beaver creatures, you have to spin a dial to land on the organ, and the weird little beaver creatures will come take the organ and stuff it back inside you. I mean, Jesus Christ, like...
Yes.
So...
See, I remember playing, there was a game, I think on Nintendo, an early Nintendo console called Little Nemo in Slumberland, based on the old Winsor McKay comics, and I loved that. It sort of had a similar sort of dream underworld sort of element to it, but absolutely not as scary. I'm sure there were, I don't remember specifics, but not nearly as graphic.
Your body remembers, I bet. Something in you is like...
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's what this podcast is all about. It's about, you know, the things that stick with us that maybe we don't even know why. Sort of speaking of which, you know, the idea of this trauma that you received by going to the Haunted Mansion at Disney World and theme parks in general, like you've spoken about the other theme parks, the different worlds that you go to as you're walking around the theme parks, like in Disney World, like Adventureland, Tomorrowland, Fantasyland. The idea of Disney World as a multiverse sort of makes me think of some elements of your book, Edenville. The way that people travel between worlds and use portals. Can you tell listeners a little bit about Edenville, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
Sort of to get us into the idea of the Renfield verse.
Well, so, Renfield County came first, and it's this valley that's been poisoned by this really horrific familicide, right? This guy kills his entire family for reasons that we don't understand, which is a very scary thing to me, that people do things for reasons we can't understand, you know, because that to me means that, like, well, I could do that at any point, you know, I could do something that I don't understand, like what keeps me from killing my whole family, a hit in the head, you know, we don't know, but so the valley becomes poisoned by just the, like, ghost of the event itself, and everything is touched by this kind of madness and pain. And what we learn in Edenville is that there's actually a stack of worlds in this, like, cosmic spine, and every vertebra of the world is connected at a point that is cursed in a similar way. There are other places in each world that have been similarly poisoned by other terrible events, or they've just, you know, the land turns sour or whatever. So there's this kind of, like, cosmic rot through the center of the multiverse, and that's what ties it all together. And you can open portals at the exact center by creating more pain. Sort of death opens the door between worlds. And maybe there's something in that too, that, like, more pain and horror and madness sort of thins the membrane and allows you to poke through that membrane into other places. Yeah, so that's the basic gist. And I'm hoping to... The book I'm working on now is sort of a standalone novel. It's after... sort of, like, I can't believe I got away with some of the stuff that I did in these first 3 books, including the one that's coming out this fall. So to be, like, kind of nice to my publisher, I was like, let me do a standalone thriller for you. This one will be easier to market and talk about. But after that one, I want to go down to some of the other worlds in the spine and explore what some of the stuff down there is like.
Did you mean to be writing a theme park?
I really learned a lot about myself in the last half hour.
Wait, I have so much more to tell you.
Oh, it's great.
About yourself.
Yeah, I don't know. I like the idea of worlds that feel like you can sink into them. I think especially now, I think that there, just in the last couple months, has been a push, at least among people that I know, I'd be curious to hear if you feel similarly, to find ways to escape that don't feel like an echo chamber. Like, you can escape into social media, but there's something that feels unhealthy about that. Mm-hmm. Or I can go back and, like, like I recently rewatched Breaking Bad because I was like, this is a nice escape that I can sink into, but I still feel like it's feeding something because the storytelling is so great. And it's, even though it's a really kind of bleak story by the end, it's a story that I've seen before. So there's something kind of comforting in that, like familiar beats, you know?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but literally had that thought in the past 24 hours. I started rewatching The Good Place. Sitcom, which is also so well written. It's such a good story, and it's very, very funny, which is what I think like I need sometimes, late at night. But so I get it. I get that idea of wanting to go back to that.
Right, and what a sweet message by the end of The Good Place. The place that that sitcom arrives at is so nice, and is an idea that I have held with me in the years since I've watched it the first time.
It goes exactly where it needs to in such a smart, intelligent, funny, and heartwarming way. I highly recommend that show to anybody who has not seen it yet.
Me too.
To sort of continue on with my next question, I want to sort of go back to the idea of the Haunted Mansion attraction and the ride itself. You know, we go into the mansion, we are led by this sort of amorphous voice who is talking to us, who introduces himself as the ghost host. We're all led as a crowd into this room where the doors shut, and it's like kind of an octagonal room, and there are paintings on the walls, and as the ceiling appears to stretch, the paintings reveal more of their own stories. And one woman, we see her portrait expand as well, and she ends up revealing that she's sitting on the grave of her husband. And each character in these paintings has sort of a secret to reveal. The lights go out and the ceiling sort of lights up, and you see the ghost host actually is the one who's been talking to us, and his body is hanging from the rafters over our heads. So I don't know if you missed that part when you closed your eyes.
100%, yeah.
So super dark, super scary, and then the doors open and you're in this room that has 40-foot ceilings, and these little carts are ant marching around, and you get into one, and each one is sort of encapsulated, and the ghost host continues to tell his story as he's leading you through the various rooms of the ride.
This sounds like me. I see where you're going with this, where it's fun from the outside. You think the host is fun, and then he's a corpse, and you're fucking along for the ride.
So there's lots of shocks and scares at the beginning of the ride, and there's music that is sort of thematically piping into the cart that you're riding in. You meet Madame Leota, who's a psychic medium trapped in a crystal orb, and she's playing musical instruments around you, and then she introduces you to the ghosts that are in the ballroom, and there's this amazing effect with something called, the term is flown out of my head. It's an old like Victorian magician tricks using like glass and mirrors and reflections to show you all of the animatronic ghosts that are dancing and floating around the ballroom. You move through an attic, and there's a bride who has an axe, and you see she's probably decapitated all of her husbands, and each room ultimately by the end, when the cart spins around, you're looking up at the stars and the owls that you mentioned. Remember seeing that music gets really happy. There's a chorus, like it's jubilant, it's silly, it's funny, and you end up riding through a graveyard where it's like total manic chaos, ghostly happenings. Before you get off of the ride, the cart sort of turns so that you're looking in the mirror, and you see that there's a ghost riding in the cart with you. The ghost host is like, take your ghost home with you. They're hitchhiking. And then you exit the ride, and that's it. Then you leave. The idea of this kind of attraction where the creators sort of were playing with the idea of a central story, but then threw that out. And each room sort of represents a different story experience. What connects all of these things together is the ghost host as a narrator, and also the music. And I guess my question for you in relating this ride to your writing is the idea of the ghost host, the music, this connective tissue between stories, between the rooms that are in the Haunted Mansion. I guess you could call a framing device. And in your new book, which is basically a collection of short stories, there is a framing device in between all of the stories. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about what The Poorly Made is about and what you were trying to do with that framing device? Do you feel like a short story collection needs to have a framing device? If not a framing device, then a through line, a thread, a thematic thing?
I think so. I think when you have a collection that, or when I'm reading a collection that doesn't have a framing device and it's short stories and trying to figure out what exactly the thematic link is, I think there are some collections that I'm kind of just along for the ride. Like anytime I pick up a Brian Evanson collection, we're sort of like, well, this is just not miasma. I don't know. It's swirling colors of just like you're just along for the ride, you know. I feel similarly about like Shirley Jackson or Priya Sharma, but I do like to have some bit of an overarching story or someone that you can rely on to guide you through. You know, that makes me think of shows like The Twilight Zone or Roald Dahl had Tales of the Unexpected for a while. Right. I used to love that one. So someone that, like, as scary as it would get, you could always kind of fall back on the fact that you could trust this person, but then every so often you couldn't quite trust them. I find that really fascinating, especially with, like, anthology movies like Body Bags. The mortician character is guiding you through, and he's kind of your buddy, but then he's kind of not, you know, as he's, like, drinking formaldehyde, I think, and things like that. So I just like that feeling that someone is, that no matter how scary it gets, you can always fall back on this person and know at the end of the day, like, it's just Roald Dahl telling you a story. Or there were several episodes of Goosebumps that R.L. Stine himself would introduce. And I think even in the Goosebumps stories themselves, somehow R.L. Stine felt like a character in and of himself. Like, you were always just getting this story from R.L. Stine. As far as story collections themselves, I've just always felt drawn to ones that feel like they're building on each other or talking to each other. I think that's more than having a frame narrative. I want the stories to talk to each other. I've read a lot of collections where the stories seem thematically linked. I'm like, okay, these are all speculative fiction stories about period horror or history. Not like period, although I would totally read that.
I think that book probably exists.
I'm sure it's out there, and if it's not, please write it, someone. But like these are all period pieces, you know, this history, whatever. But I just love books like Dandelion Wine or Tonto and Lone Ranger Fistfight in Heaven. And then later, Hemingway has a great one called In Our Time. Like, I just want the stories to, in some way, talk to each other. Which I guess, like, again, not quite a short story collection, but all the stories in the Goosebumps universe do kind of talk to each other because they're all in these sort of suburban settings, and they're all kind of conversing about similar, you know, ideas. I've just always loved that sense. And I oh gosh, even I meant to listen to it, but I saw you just did an episode recently about Shelley Duvall, which is another, like, that's a great one.
Love Shelley. I love Shelley. I still love Shelley. I will always love Shelley.
Yeah. It's a really sweet show, but she went to some weird places with that one too.
Oh, for sure. Derek Chow is the guest who brought that to the podcast, and he had a lot of really fun things to say about what scared him about watching that show. Yeah. If anybody listening hasn't listened to that episode, go listen to it, but also, like, try and find episodes of that show. It won a Peabody Award. She produced it. It's super smart. She starred in a few episodes, and it's pretty clever.
Yeah, it's a really sweet world that she inhabits, but also, like, kind of weird and, like, outside of time in a weird way. But yeah, I just loved having a guide through story. So even if it's not, like, a full frame narrative, I just like the sense that there is someone guiding me from piece to piece and kind of, like, I don't know, like, not explaining the significance of every piece. Like, I don't want it to be that ham-fisted, but just, like, sort of pointing out the major points. You know, I think Roald Dahl was always good about that on his show, because he would say something like, this story is really about what it means to suffer or whatever.
Oh, wow.
Like, okay, cool. That's an interesting idea to keep in mind as I'm watching this. So I just like that idea. And so The Poorly Made, it started, the frame narrative was its own story. I was writing this story about the murder that happens. This guy kills his family, and their blood soaks into the ground, but it didn't quite have a plot. And so I was working on this for my MFA thesis, and my advisor was like, you need some characters or some stakes or something. You can't just have a nice story about a haunted farmland. So I kind of started adding in this character who was slowly starting to respond to this curse, and it affected her grandmother. And then I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun if in the collection we're getting these pieces of history and they're sort of loose in between these stories, and then at a certain point we get this first person point of view to come in, and we have this I narrator who says, now I'm reacting to the curse. And so there was sort of a turn originally. All my advisors were like, because I had 2 or 3 of them over the course of my MFA, and all 3 of them were like, yeah, this doesn't work. So I was like, okay, from the front end, she has to be the one to say, this is what's at stake for me, and I live in this environment, and then the mystery that we unravel is not about her, but about the environment. So it sort of flipped it. And that seemed to work a lot better. And so then initially it was one long email that she's writing, and it's kind of broken up. It was my editor at William Morrow who suggested we cut it up into separate emails. And so she really created this storyline of desperation, because now as you read through the book, we're getting, the first email is relatively calm. And by the last email, whoever she's writing to, and I won't spoil it too bad, but isn't writing back. And so she's like, okay, you really got to write back now. And now I'm staying up all night, and I'm really drunk, and I'm like really scared, Those emotional stakes really came in kind of gradually over time. But for me, it was always about the environment and exploring what it feels like to just be in that environment, which I guess is kind of Hudson Valley awe. As a kid driving through this area, it's like, as an 8-year-old, my parents were like, let's go for a walk around the Vanderbilt estate. And I had no idea. Like, I had no way of understanding what that meant. Now, I actually just finished reading House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. Have you ever read that one? Or have you read her stuff? Okay.
I've read some of her ghost stories, and I read Ethan Frome in high school, and I kind of want to go back and read more, because I do like her.
Edith... it writes a really mean novel of manners. The House of Mirth is a really well-honed tragedy, I think, and would highly recommend it. I mean, it's the reading experience is different, right? Because it's kind of long relative to a lot of books that are coming out today, and the language is a little bit dense. I mean, it's over 100 years old at this point, so it's not like archaic, but it definitely I had to kind of concentrate. But just really beautifully rendered character study of this woman who's trapped in an environment, trapped in, the late 1800s high society of New York City, and then that spills over into the Hudson Valley. In the very first scene, she's taking a train up to Rhinebeck to go to a fictionalized version of what is believed to be Mill's Mansion, because Edith would hang out at Mill's Mansion all the time, and the characters who are at the fictionalized version of this mansion love bridge, and apparently Mrs. Mills loved bridge, and so there are a lot of connections there that I love. But again, it's just the atmosphere, it's just being in that atmosphere is what to me makes that so readable. And so with Renfield County and everything else, I just want it to feel like a world you can go to. And I think that's in some ways, I think people are still interested in Game of Thrones, but I think that interest has petered out because it's not a world that anyone really wants to go to. There's nothing about that world that people are particularly drawn to compared to Harry Potter. Even though there's an immense pushback, that world is still something people talk about. And
for sure. It's appealing.
Yeah. So I wanted it to be a world that, despite all its craziness, still feels like a place that could have its own theme park or, you wanted to go to.
So getting back to the theme park thing, getting back to the Haunted Mansion ride, what we talked about a little bit earlier is the sort of the artists creating the ride itself were sort of, one of them wanted scary, one of them wanted funny, and it ended up being a little bit of both. And I notice as a writer, your voice definitely is exactly that push and pull of the narrator, even third person narrator, being sort of cheeky and funny and that sort of wink, and also then like people bursting into spider monsters and horrifying things happening to their bodies. And I guess my question for you is, how do you decide where to inject the humor in these tales of the grotesque and violence and cosmic horror? Like, how do you juggle that?
Well, that's a really good question. I think for me, it's all about the song of it. Like, if you have too many funny beats, then it's like you're going too far up the scale. And so when you have the next note is kind of a horrific note, like it doesn't quite gel, So I just try to pay attention to the flow of each beat. I think just like what is a realistic reaction for people to have, especially in Edenville. A lot of that humor comes from the fact that Quinn and Cam are two relatively normal people who enter a world of caricature, right? Like every character that they meet in Edenville is in some way not static, but like kind of flat in the Dickensian sense, where like this character has a particular limp or a particular bit or something. Like they all have particular bits, and Cam and Quinn don't necessarily have bits that stick to them. So I just, a lot of that humor came from like, well, what would you do if you were a normal person in a land surrounded by caricatures and bits? You have to kind of point it out and laugh about it. Compared to some of the characters in Renfield County who grew up in the county and grew up in this land of characters and bits, and so I think aren't quite allowed to be normal people, that they just get kind of beaten down by this environment and feel lonely and othered in various ways. And that's where the title comes from, that these people who are struggling with depression or addiction or whatever feel as if they themselves are poorly made. And that's kind of what the curse and the Renfield giant offers you, is that if you give in, you can make yourself something better. You can live forever, but there's a price, of course, right? I don't know how well that answers your question, but that's kind of how I think about the humor, and also like what the title means to me as well.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think that's really great. And actually what you just said about the sort of the ordinary people moving into a realm of sort of caricatures, it leads to another question, or maybe a statement, or maybe an analysis that is unasked for. But I guess regarding the topic that you brought here, did you recognize the inspiration of the Disney parks as being sort of integral to this world that you created? And I'm going to point out the ways that I recognize.
Oh God, Dane is really tearing me apart today.
Well, this with? I'm not tearing you apart. I'm just asking because like I think it's fascinating when I ask for a topic from a guest, from a writer, from an artist. Like I feel like there's something unconscious in the decision that you all make to say, this is the thing I want to talk about. Because as we enter a Disney park, we are guests that are ordinary, and we are encountering caricatures. We are encountering a land that is strange and unusual as observers, and sometimes we're asked to participate in these various rituals, whether that's getting onto a ride, whether that's waiting in a line, whether that's going to see a show. These are all things that are in your book. We have people, us, as visitors to the park, moving between worlds. We've talked about like the Adventureland, Tomorrowland, Fantasyland. At the center of the park, we have a charismatic leader. The statue of Walt Disney, I could sort of correspond to the idea of the giant.
Yeah.
We have an underground system of tunnels underneath Disney World, connecting parts of the park, just like your tunnels connect parts of the Edenville campus.
Oh, wow.
We even have people wearing other people's skin and being able to switch out of their bodies and change characters. Who is Winnie the Pooh? Who's wearing the Mickey costume today? What are your thoughts on all this, Sam?
Oh, it's so true. And I say, like, tearing me apart in the best possible way. Like, really, I buy all of this. I think, and maybe that's it, because as I was talking earlier, I was like, even though I didn't see the ride, being in it and, like, letting it soak into my brain is maybe more informative than I gave it credit for. Because it's so true. And even the experience of writing Edenville, I had someone point out to me just yesterday. She was like, because I know you really well. I know that, like, you were working as an SAT tutor in Brooklyn. And you had this relationship that you were kind of unhappy with. And then when COVID hit, you moved up to the Hudson Valley. And, you know, you loved the Hudson Valley. But there were these old ladies who worked at the library that you didn't like. And she was like, and that's exactly what Edenville is. Like, they have this relationship. They're in Brooklyn. They come up to the Hudson Valley. God. And I was like, oh, fuck. I'm busted, man. You got me. So I think it's true. And I think...
so then maybe the Hudson Valley is a theme park, too, in a way. I wouldn't disagree with that.
No, we're a land of... I mean, in the same way that you can go get your sweet treats and brews anywhere around the park. Like, we're a land of breweries and distilleries and big burger places. And there are hiking
trails, and there's
hiking trails, yeah.
There's canoeing, there's the river, there's the mountains, there's swimming. There's so much to do. It's almost like all of the different parts of these theme parks that we're talking about. It's very true.
Tunnels, and sort of, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm sure. I've just got to. Well, there are cave systems.
True.
This is where we live. I mean, I live in the Hudson Valley too. Like you're down in Poughkeepsie. I live in a town, village called Saugerties, and I actually have this like written here at the end. I sort of want to tie up the conversation with saying, you know, behind the attraction on Disney Plus, that show I was mentioning, they state that the Haunted Mansion in Walt Disney World is based on the mansions along the Hudson River. My particular favorite one is Olana, the Frederick Church residence outside of Hudson or in Hudson.
Oh my gosh. And are you going to pull out what I think you're going to pull out?
No.
Oh, do you not know? Okay. I around the time when I was starting to really write The Poorly Made, I was driving up and down Route 9 a lot because I was going to the Olana for rehearsals for a play that was on the grounds in which I played Frederick Church, because I had a friend who was commissioned to write the thing. I thought you were totally like you had dug up somehow. Like, but
that's amazing.
No, so I feel really connected to Olana because I spent several months in Church's world and learning a lot about him. And he had kind of a tragic story as well. He lost several kids to illness, and his wife, you know, handled that extremely poorly. I don't want to say like, because, you know, this is kind of distilled through like 1800s speak, so I don't know how much of her mind she actually lost and how much of, you know, she was like being a hysteric pain in the ass or whatever, quote unquote. But clearly was really struggling with this loss. Yeah, Olana is like, every time I hear someone mention it, I'm kind of like,
well, it's so striking when you drive across the Rip Van Winkle Bridge from Catskill towards Hudson, from west towards east. It's sitting right, that mansion is sitting right on top of that hill. And before I even knew what it was, I was completely taken with that, the idea of the mansion on the hill. It made me think of Hill House. It made me think of the Haunted Mansion. It made me think of all of these things that, as a teenager, as a young kid, I was like, I actually moved to the land of the Haunted Mansion.
Oh,
so
cool.
It makes sense to me that what you were writing about, you know, the horrors that could possibly exist in the Hudson Valley, New York State, just north of New York City, about 2 hours for those of you who don't know what we're talking about. There's an energy here. There is something that that I write about too. The books that I write about are often set in the Catskills. My Shadow House series, before I even moved here, was set in a Hudson Valley town about the ruins of a mansion. There are ruins of a mansion in Cold Spring. If you hike up a hill, and the walls, they're still stone, they're still standing, and there's lots of chimneys. It is so creepy and intact and weird, and like that was a huge inspiration for me as well.
There's a dentist who had an estate. Maybe that's in Fishkill, or is that?
I don't know. Sounds like the one that I'm talking about.
Who knows? There are ruins all around.
There are ruins. I have a coffee table book called Ghosts of the Hudson Valley, which are basically portraits of all of the mansions up and down the Hudson Valley. So many of them burned down or just were left to ruin. The ones that remain are often turned into museums or part of a school campus, a college campus. There's so much to mine here. And I guess the question I was going to ask you is what inspires you about this area to get super dark? But I feel like we've already gone there. I think you've explained the place that we're living in. I
mean, yeah, especially driving up and down Route 9. Like I said, if you want a good sense of the Hudson Valley, I would say come up to this is my like Instagrammable, like, it's Hudson Valley day trip. Come up to the Poughkeepsie train station and drive up 9 into through Rhinebeck and up to Hudson and stay there until night and then drive back. And you'll get a good sense of like everything the Hudson Valley has to offer in many ways, I think. It's just such a, like, so many images from The Poorly Made came from that drive. Detour, WAG.
Oh God, WAG, yeah. No, totally see that.
Yeah, and Cats, you know, that diner. Actually, the diner from Cats I always imagined as, it's up by Hillsdale, and it's on this, like, cliff overlooking the Taconic. But it's got a giant neon sign. Oh, yeah.
The headdress,
the Native American and the headdress dude, Chief, you know, it's called something like Chief Diner.
I think it is.
You know?
I think you're right.
But yeah, so much imagery just came from driving along Route 9. And so that's why County Road 7 then in the universe became such a big deal for me. And my editor was like, "Oh, should we name the other roads or whatever?" And I was like, "Man, it doesn't matter. This is the only one that like really sticks in my memory." So it's a theme park. It's its own theme park.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fun to live in a place that is so rich in history and in culture, and the people who are continuing to create these things, who've lived here for a long time, who are recent transplants. It's a pleasure to live here, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you about this, Sam. I appreciate you coming on to Our First Fears.
Oh my gosh, this was so much fun. Thank you for having me. I really got a kick out of this. I love, it is a dream to have your stuff be analyzed. You know, you do like these interviews where people are like, well, how did you think of this idea? Or what about this or whatever? But when someone like comes in with like analysis, that's always like, that's so much fun.
I did not mean to do that. I was just pointing out what I felt was obvious.
No, it's the best. I mean that like really complimentary. I'm like really genuinely like, because I think you want to learn about yourself when you're writing stuff and putting stuff out there, even as just, you know, quote unquote, just stories. There's some piece of that like I want to be reflected back. Like I want to hear what you got out of this story more than just like it was entertaining or it was scary, but like what did it say to you? Because that'll learn me what I was trying to say, or like, you know, what was coming out of me that you got that you can then say back to me so that I can understand more about it. You know what I mean? Like it's a weird.
I totally hear you. So, I don't know if you've ever spoken with. I think you have spoken with Neil McRobert on Talking Scared, that podcast.
Oh yeah, he does a very similar thing.
He's really good at it, and that's why I love listening to his show as well. But anyway, thank you so much, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.
You too. Thanks again to Sam Rebelein for taking the time to chat with me on Our First Fears. I know Sam was joking about our shared neighborhood/universe being an Instagrammable post, but seriously, if you're ever in New York City and looking for a day trip, the train ride up the Hudson River alone is more than worth the trip. We really do live in the land of Washington Irving. I can see the clove about which that author wrote the Rip Van Winkle story from my bedroom window. It's magical. And check out Sam's books. The Poorly Made is very, very scary. Just right for these dark days. Follow my social media at Our First Fears and at Dan Poblocks on Instagram, or find me on Blue Sky. You can also reach out at ourfirstfears@gmail.com. If you do want to get in touch, let me know. Which Disney character's skin would be your pick to wear while working in the hot Florida sun? Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.